The orchestra stopped 7 minutes before Ethan Carter was supposed to marry Victoria Langford, not because anyone had missed a cue, but because a woman in the final row had quietly asked the violinist to check beneath his chair. The musician found a plain brown envelope taped to the wood, with Ethan's name printed across the front and a warning beneath it. If the ceremony begins, someone will destroy the only record proving what happened to Riverbend. Ethan recognized the name immediately, although he had not spoken it aloud in 11 years, since the morning a neighborhood restoration project collapsed and ended the partnership that had once held his marriage together. When he looked toward the woman who had discovered the envelope, Naomi Brooks was already watching him, wearing an emerald dress, and the expression she used whenever a structure looked stable from a distance, but dangerous up close. She had received his wedding invitation 3 weeks earlier, even though he had not sent it, and she had come because the handwriting on the envelope matched a note delivered to her office the previous night. Before either of them could speak, Ethan's best man, Daniel Ross, stepped away from the ceremony platform and disappeared through a service door. Victoria noticed him leave and asked Ethan whether the interruption involved his company, because most disruptions in his life eventually did. Ethan answered that he did not know, although the lie came too easily, shaped by years of protecting other people from information he had not yet decided how to use. Naomi approached without acknowledging the guests turning toward her, then handed Ethan the envelope while keeping her voice low enough to protect the ceremony from becoming immediate spectacle. Inside were 3 items: a photograph of Riverbend Community Center before its demolition, a key stamped with the number 314, and a copied page from a Carter Global audit listing payments to a contractor that had never existed. Ethan recognized his electronic authorization at the bottom, but the date came from a weekend when he and Naomi had been in Vermont signing their divorce settlement. Naomi asked whether someone could have used his credentials, and Ethan replied that Daniel had managed his approvals during that period, which sounded less like an answer than an accusation he was not prepared to make. Victoria listened carefully, then asked why a long-dead community project had returned on their wedding day, and Naomi said the same question had kept her awake all night. The wedding planner asked whether the orchestra should resume, but Victoria requested 10 minutes and instructed security to close the ballroom doors without alarming the guests. Her composure unsettled Ethan because he had expected jealousy, not competence, and he realized he had underestimated another woman by assuming emotion would make her less capable of judgment. Naomi explained that Riverbend had never been an ordinary project. It had been the first neighborhood trust she and Ethan created together, using a legal covenant that prohibited displacement without resident approval. 11 years earlier, a fire damaged the center, the city condemned the property, and Carter Global withdrew after insurers claimed the repairs would exceed the building's value. Naomi had always believed the fire report was incomplete, but she lacked evidence, while Ethan accepted Daniel's assurance that fighting the decision would bankrupt their new company. Their argument became the first crack in a marriage, later weakened by missed dinners, postponed plans, and Ethan's habit of calling absence responsibility. The brown envelope now suggested the fire had not merely ended a project. It had cleared land for a private redevelopment company that quietly became one of Carter Global's earliest profitable partners. A hotel employee entered and told Ethan that Daniel's car remained in the underground garage, although Daniel himself could not be found. Security footage showed him leaving the ballroom, entering an elevator, then disappearing from every camera between the second floor and the garage. Naomi examined the copied audit page and noticed that the false contractor's mailing address belonged to a vacant office above an old pharmacy near Riverbend. The key marked 314 likely opened a mailbox or storage unit, but no location appeared anywhere in the envelope. Ethan wanted to contact corporate security, yet Naomi reminded him that Daniel had supervised that department for 14 years and selected most of its senior staff. Victoria suggested calling the police, but Ethan hesitated because the evidence could be fabricated, and a public investigation would instantly connect his wedding to financial crimes. Naomi studied him for a moment, then said, "That hesitation is how Riverbend disappeared the first time." The sentence hurt because it was not cruel, and because she had not needed to raise her voice to remind him who he became whenever truth threatened the life he had already arranged. Ethan asked Naomi whether she believed Daniel had set the fire, but she refused to replace missing evidence with an accusation that happened to satisfy their history. Instead, she pointed toward the orchestra chair and asked how the sender knew exactly where Ethan's name card would be placed before the wedding staff completed the seating plan. Only 4 people had accessed the final layout: the wedding planner, Victoria, Daniel, and Victoria's younger brother Lucas, who managed communications for the Langford Family Foundation. Victoria did not defend Lucas immediately, which told Ethan she had already considered the possibility. She explained that her brother had disappeared from a charity board meeting 2 days earlier after discovering irregular payments between the Langford Foundation and a Carter Global Development Fund. Lucas claimed someone had copied his login credentials, then stopped answering calls after sending Victoria a message that read, "Do not marry him until you know what his company purchased with our name." She had assumed her brother was frightened and angry, but the wording now sounded connected to the warning under the violinist's chair. The ballroom doors opened briefly as Senator Eleanor Hayes arrived late, bringing winter air and a federal investigator named Mara Chen, whose presence immediately changed the stakes. Eleanor apologized to Victoria, then explained that Lucas had contacted her office 48 hours earlier and requested whistleblower protection, claiming he had uncovered a financial structure linking Riverbend, Carter Global, and the Langford Foundation. Before he could deliver the complete records, Lucas vanished, and his last verified phone signal came from inside the Astoria Grand Hotel that morning. Mara stated that Daniel was already under confidential investigation for procurement fraud, but federal agents had delayed action because they lacked evidence connecting him to the original Riverbend transactions. The envelope could provide that connection, although someone had clearly chosen a theatrical delivery designed to force Ethan and Naomi into the same room. Ethan asked whether Lucas might have planted it, but Mara answered that hotel security had found traces of Lucas's blood in a freight elevator. Then she placed a photograph on the table showing Daniel entering that elevator with Lucas less than an hour before Naomi arrived. Mara ordered hotel security to preserve every recording while agents searched the restricted floors, but Ethan insisted on joining them because Daniel would speak to him before speaking to law enforcement. Naomi said Daniel had relied upon that loyalty for years, and Mara warned that personal access could compromise the investigation. Yet Victoria surprised everyone by supporting Ethan's request. She understood that Daniel's flaw was not simply greed. He needed Ethan to believe their shared history placed him beyond suspicion. Allowing Ethan to approach him could create the mistake investigators had been waiting for, provided Ethan followed instructions and resisted improvising. Mara fitted a recording device beneath Ethan's jacket, while Naomi remained with the audit page and began tracing the false contractor through public property records. Victoria asked to accompany her, explaining that the Langford Foundation's payments might reveal why Lucas became involved. The 2 women left the ballroom through a separate corridor, not as allies yet, but as adults who understood that rivalry would serve the person manipulating them. Ethan and Mara reached the freight elevator, where technicians found a broken cufflink, 2 drops of blood, and a narrow strip of gray fabric caught beside the maintenance panel. Ethan recognized the material from Daniel's morning suit, although Daniel had changed into formal clothes before the ceremony. The elevator's internal camera had been disabled, but the control log showed an unauthorized stop between the 3rd and 4th floors, where no public landing existed. Mara located a service hatch behind decorative paneling and followed a maintenance passage into an unfinished storage level hidden above the hotel kitchens. They found Lucas seated against a concrete wall with his wrists bound, conscious but disoriented, and a shallow cut above his eyebrow. He identified Daniel as the man who brought him there, but he also admitted Daniel had not struck him. Another person wearing a hotel security jacket had attacked them both, taken Lucas's phone, and ordered Daniel to leave before police arrived. Daniel had whispered that he would fix everything, then abandoned Lucas in the dark. Lucas told Ethan that he had uncovered the suspicious transfers while reviewing the Langford Foundation's affordable housing grants. Millions of dollars had passed through an organization called Harbor Civic Partners, whose board included respected philanthropists and retired judges. Yet the organization appeared to have no employees, projects, or physical office. The payments eventually reached companies that purchased condemned properties near Riverbend after the fire, including the land beneath Naomi's original community center. Lucas assumed Carter Global had secretly profited, but deeper records showed something stranger. Ethan's company had lost money while Daniel-controlled contractors received unusually high fees. The arrangement looked less like corporate corruption directed by Ethan and more like a long-running extraction scheme hidden inside his expansion. Lucas had confronted Daniel privately because Daniel once mentored him, and Daniel confessed that the fraud began as a way to save Carter Global from collapse during its first recession. He claimed he intended to repay the money, but each cover-up required another transaction, another compromised official, and eventually another family forced from property someone else wanted. When Ethan asked why Daniel kidnapped him, Lucas shook his head and said Daniel had actually begged him to wait until after the wedding. Daniel feared the real architect of the scheme would destroy the remaining records and harm anyone who exposed them. Lucas refused, so Daniel brought him to the hotel, intending to show him evidence hidden in a private safe, but the security-clad attacker intercepted them. Before losing consciousness, Lucas heard Daniel call the attacker Caleb, a name Ethan recognized from Carter Global's former risk director, Caleb Voss. Caleb had supposedly died in a boating accident 9 years earlier, shortly after an internal compliance review questioned early Riverbend contracts. Mara checked federal databases and found that no body had ever been recovered. The death certificate relied upon witness testimony supplied by Daniel. Ethan felt the room tilt as a memory returned of Daniel standing beside him at the memorial, grieving so convincingly that Ethan never asked who had benefited from Caleb's disappearance. Lucas then revealed that the safe Daniel intended to open was room 314, an executive records suite inside the hotel's original office wing. Naomi and Victoria reached the same conclusion through a different route after discovering that Harbor Civic Partners rented room 314 for private board meetings 11 years earlier. The hotel had since converted the wing into archival storage, but the original lock remained because ownership of the contents was disputed. Naomi used the numbered key while Victoria called Mara, and they entered a windowless room containing filing cabinets, sealed banker boxes, and a small desk facing no windows. Dust suggested no one had visited recently, yet a lamp remained warm, and a paper cup of coffee stood beside a portable scanner. Someone had been copying records minutes earlier. Victoria found folders containing grant applications signed by her late father, Senator Hayes, and several trustees who publicly supported Naomi's work. Naomi recognized her own signature on a Riverbend resident covenant, but the final page had been replaced with language allowing emergency transfer of the property. The forged initials beside the change resembled hers closely enough to survive casual review, and she understood why Daniel once urged Ethan to stop fighting the condemnation. Someone had transformed Naomi's strongest legal protection into the mechanism that removed the residence. A door closed behind them, and Daniel stepped from the adjoining records alcove holding Lucas's missing phone. He looked exhausted rather than threatening, with dried blood along his collar and one sleeve torn where the attacker had grabbed him. Victoria demanded to know where Caleb was, but Daniel answered that Caleb would reach the room soon because the envelope had forced everyone toward the same evidence. He admitted placing the warning beneath the violinist's chair, using information obtained from the wedding planner's shared scheduling account. He had also sent Naomi the forged invitation because she was the only person who would recognize the Riverbend covenant and refused to accept a convenient explanation. Ethan, Daniel said, would protect the company until undeniable evidence appeared, while Victoria would protect the wedding unless her brother became involved. Naomi asked why he had not simply gone to federal investigators, and Daniel replied that he had tried 9 years earlier, shortly before Caleb staged his death and threatened Daniel's wife. Mara arrived with Ethan and Lucas as Daniel opened a steel cabinet containing the original Riverbend files. Before anyone could secure them, the room's fire alarm sounded, the sprinkler system activated, and water began pouring directly over the paper records. Naomi saw that only the sprinklers above the cabinets had opened, proving someone had manually triggered a targeted system rather than a genuine alarm. Daniel grabbed the oldest boxes while Ethan disconnected the nearest valve, and Victoria moved the scanner away from the water. Mara ordered everyone into the corridor, but Naomi noticed a blinking transmitter beneath the desk and realized the sprinklers were only a distraction. Through the fogged glass partition, a man in a hotel security uniform entered the adjoining service hall and rolled a container toward the records room. Daniel whispered Caleb's name, then said the container held an industrial solvent that would destroy paper, hard drives, and fingerprints within minutes. The man removed his cap, revealing a face Ethan had last seen inside a silver memorial frame 9 years earlier. Caleb did not attempt to flee when federal agents surrounded the corridor because escape had never been his immediate purpose. He raised both hands, smiled at Daniel, and said the records had already served their function by bringing every essential witness into one controlled location. Mara ordered him away from the solvent container, yet Caleb explained that the drum contained water and harmless cleaning chemicals, not evidence-destroying acid. The threat had been another test, designed to reveal which documents Daniel rescued first and who instinctively protected whom. Agents opened the container and confirmed his claim, while Caleb calmly requested an attorney and refused further questions. Daniel lunged toward him, but Ethan restrained his former partner before anger created the violent image Caleb clearly wanted. Naomi studied Caleb's expression and realized he was not frightened by arrest because he expected the evidence inside room 314 to implicate everyone except himself. The records had been curated, not preserved, and each apparent discovery might be another piece of architecture built to direct blame. Mara sealed the room and separated the witnesses, while forensic technicians examined the documents Daniel saved from the sprinklers. The first folder contained proof that he authorized fraudulent contractors, bribed inspectors, and moved grant funds between shell organizations. Daniel did not deny the signatures, explaining that Caleb designed the transactions and threatened to expose Ethan as the beneficiary if Daniel refused. Ethan asked why Daniel never trusted him with the truth, and Daniel answered with exhausted anger that Ethan had never wanted truth once success became expensive. During Carter Global's early recession, Ethan demanded solutions without layoffs, investor panic, or delayed expansion, then rewarded Daniel every time he produced impossible results without asking how. Daniel convinced himself he was protecting his friend until protection became the story he used to excuse every new crime. His flaw was not blind loyalty but resentment, because part of him wanted Ethan's admiration while secretly despising the innocence Ethan could maintain by refusing operational details. Caleb recognized that resentment and transformed Daniel into both accomplice and future scapegoat. The forensic team uncovered another surprise inside Naomi's forged covenant. The replacement page had been printed on archival paper manufactured 3 years after the Riverbend fire. The document could not have enabled the original property transfer, meaning someone created it later to rewrite the legal history. Naomi remembered submitting a certified copy of the True Covenant to Hudson University's Community Design Archive before Carter Global withdrew. That copy had disappeared during a cataloging renovation 8 years earlier, when Caleb served on the university's risk committee under a donated consulting contract. Mara concluded that Caleb had spent years manufacturing parallel records, preserving enough authentic material to support whatever version benefited him. He was not merely hiding fraud, he was building competing narratives so that every investigator would find evidence confirming the suspect they already preferred. Ethan's reputation made him an obvious villain, Daniel's signatures made him a practical one, and Naomi's forged initials made her vulnerable if she challenged either story. Caleb had treated truth like a market, supplying each observer with the version they were most willing to purchase. Victoria discovered the next clue while reviewing photographs from her father's foundation archives. In several images taken after the Riverbend fire, Caleb appeared beside Thomas Langford, Victoria's late father, during private redevelopment meetings. Thomas publicly supported affordable housing, but his construction company later purchased land surrounding Riverbend through intermediaries. Victoria had spent her adult life defending his legacy, and the possibility that he participated in displacement threatened the identity upon which her foundation and social standing were built. Ethan offered to examine the files privately, but Victoria refused the protection and asked Mara to include her father's records in the investigation. She admitted that Lucas had previously raised concerns, yet she discouraged him because accusations against their father felt like betrayal. Lucas answered that loyalty became dangerous when families used it to protect memories rather than people. Victoria accepted the criticism without defending herself, although the grief in her face showed how much easier anger would have been. Naomi recognized the struggle because she had once protected her own image of Ethan long after the marriage stopped reflecting it. A surviving hotel ledger showed that Thomas Langford, Daniel, and Caleb met inside room 314 the night before the Riverbend fire. Ethan's name appeared on the reservation, but his signature looked genuine rather than forged. He denied attending until Naomi reminded him of a fundraising dinner they left early after arguing about Riverbend's finances. Ethan remembered drinking alone at the hotel bar, then accepting Daniel's request to review emergency investment documents in an upstairs office. He had signed several pages without reading them carefully because Naomi had threatened to leave if he abandoned another community meeting, and he wanted to return home before she packed. The memory destroyed the comforting boundary between negligence and participation. Caleb may have manipulated the documents, but Ethan knowingly signed agreements he did not understand because preserving his schedule mattered more than questioning their consequences. That signature gave Caleb the authority used to move money, and later persuaded officials that Carter Global supported the redevelopment. Ethan had not designed the scheme, yet the scheme depended upon the version of himself he had chosen to become. Caleb's attorney arrived and offered federal prosecutors a deal. Caleb would reveal the location of the original Riverbend covenant and records proving who ordered the fire, but only if Ethan publicly admitted responsibility for the fraudulent authorizations before the wedding guests departed. Mara called the demand coercive theater, yet Caleb understood Ethan's central weakness better than anyone. A private confession could be managed through lawyers, while a public admission would destroy his image before he knew the full truth. Caleb expected him to refuse, allowing the original records to remain hidden and reinforcing the claim that wealthy leaders valued reputation above accountability. Ethan asked whether compliance would guarantee access, but Mara warned that no agreement could be trusted without verifiable evidence. Naomi said Caleb's demand was not about legal leverage. He wanted to prove that Ethan still measured morality by the size of the audience. Victoria looked toward the ballroom where hundreds of guests waited behind closed doors, then told Ethan the wedding had already changed, whether they admitted it or not. Ethan returned to the ceremony platform without Daniel, Naomi, or federal agents beside him. He explained that serious evidence connected Carter Global to the removal of Riverbend residents and that his signature appeared on documents he had failed to read. He did not accuse Daniel, Caleb, or Thomas Langford because blaming others before the investigation ended would repeat the same instinct that allowed the harm to remain hidden. Several guests began recording, while reporters near the rear immediately transmitted his words beyond the hotel. Ethan admitted that ignorance created through deliberate distance was not innocence, then announced that the wedding would be postponed until Victoria could decide whether she wished to marry the man standing before her rather than the reputation prepared for public display. Victoria joined him and confirmed the decision, despite the pain it caused her family and the humiliation waiting in tomorrow's headlines. When Ethan finished, Mara received a message from Caleb containing a photograph of the original covenant inside a bank deposit box. The timestamp proved the document still existed, but the access record showed Naomi had opened the box only 6 months earlier. Every eye in the private conference room shifted toward Naomi, who examined the photograph without immediately defending herself. The bank logo belonged to an institution in Philadelphia, and the access record carried her legal signature beside the date, time, and deposit box number. Ethan asked whether she had found the covenant and hidden it, while Victoria demanded to know why Naomi allowed an investigation to continue if she already possessed the most important evidence. Naomi explained that she had visited the bank after receiving an anonymous notice claiming Riverbend records were stored there, but the box contained only a blank folder and a photograph of Ethan signing documents in room 314. She reported the visit to the National Community Design Council, although the notice came through a protected channel that prevented her from identifying the source. Mara verified that Naomi disclosed the incident 6 months earlier, yet the digital access record now showed a second opening 9 minutes after she left. Someone had copied her signature and used a duplicate credential, creating another trail designed to implicate her later. The bank's surveillance archive had been deleted under routine retention rules, but a maintenance invoice revealed that Caleb's security company serviced the branch during the relevant week. Mara obtained emergency authorization to search the deposit box, while Ethan remained at the hotel to face his board, and Victoria contacted trustees of her family foundation. Naomi accompanied Mara because the covenant's authenticity depended upon architectural exhibits and resident signatures she knew intimately. Inside the Philadelphia vault, they found the original agreement, a sealed fire investigator's notebook, and an audio recorder wrapped in cloth. The notebook documented traces of accelerant inside Riverbend Community Center, contradicting the official finding that faulty wiring caused the fire. The investigator, Samuel Price, wrote that Thomas Langford pressured city officials to suppress the result because his company had already negotiated options on adjacent land. A final entry stated that Caleb Voss offered Price enough money to disappear, but Price refused and planned to deliver copies to Naomi. 3 days later, he died in a highway collision classified as accidental. The recorder contained a conversation between Caleb, Thomas, and Daniel, captured by Price during the meeting in room 314. Thomas wanted the Riverbend property cleared before residents could finalize their covenant, while Caleb proposed using a controlled overnight fire that would damage the center without injuring anyone. Daniel objected, not because the plan was criminal, but because Ethan would never approve it, and Naomi would investigate until she uncovered the truth. Thomas responded that Ethan did not need to approve anything if his signature could be obtained on emergency financing documents. Daniel warned that manipulating Ethan would destroy their company and his marriage, yet he eventually agreed to provide the paperwork after Caleb promised the fire would remain limited. The recording established that Daniel joined the conspiracy before threats against his wife began, destroying his claim that coercion explained everything. It also revealed a deeper motive. Daniel believed Naomi's community work kept Ethan emotionally tied to a life that prevented Carter Global from reaching its potential. Removing Riverbend meant removing the final project capable of pulling Ethan away from expansion. Naomi listened twice to the moment Daniel described her as the conscience he cannot afford, and the words reopened an old wound from a direction she had never anticipated. She had spent years believing Ethan consciously chose the company over their marriage, while Daniel had engineered crises, altered schedules, and framed her work as a threat to employees who depended upon Ethan. Ethan still made his own choices, but those choices occurred inside a reality Daniel carefully distorted. Naomi felt a dangerous temptation to revise the entire marriage and absolve the man she once loved, because discovering manipulation often made forgiveness appear simpler than accountability. Mara warned her that truth rarely restored clean innocence. It redistributed responsibility among people who preferred single villains. Daniel enabled the fire. Caleb designed it. Thomas financed it. Ethan signed unread documents, and Naomi ignored warning signs because she trusted legal safeguards more than human motives. The tragedy survived through different failures, each smaller than arson, but essential to its success. Back at the hotel, Carter Global's board demanded Ethan blame Daniel and immediately deny personal knowledge of the Riverbend plan. Their attorneys argued that the audio recording proved he was deceived, creating a legal path to preserve the company and protect thousands of jobs. Ethan asked whether the plan included restitution for displaced residents, and the directors answered that admitting broader liability would invite claims from every redevelopment project Daniel supervised. Their reasoning carried genuine economic consequences, yet it repeated the old bargain: protect the institution now, address people later, and trust that later would eventually arrive. Victoria entered with evidence that her father's foundation received profits from Riverbend land sales, which meant her family wealth had grown partly through the displacement. She announced that the foundation would freeze grants, open its records, and transfer disputed assets into an independently managed restitution trust. Her mother threatened to remove her as chair, while several trustees accused her of destroying a legacy built over 40 years. Victoria replied that a legacy requiring hidden victims was not worth preserving. Mara returned with Naomi and played the recording for Ethan, who remained silent until Daniel's voice described manipulating him through manufactured emergencies. Daniel had repeatedly scheduled investor crises on dates when Naomi needed Ethan at Riverbend, then told each spouse the other had chosen competing priorities. He intercepted messages, minimized Naomi's achievements, and convinced Ethan that her disappointment revealed contempt for his ambition. Ethan felt anger toward Daniel, but beneath it lay grief for the man who had accepted every convenient interpretation because it excused his absence. Naomi told him the recording changed facts, not consequences. Daniel influenced the path, but Ethan still walked it. Ethan asked whether she believed their marriage might have survived without the manipulation, and Naomi answered honestly that she did not know. They were young, proud, and afraid of becoming smaller inside each other's dreams, which meant Daniel exploited existing fractures rather than creating them from nothing. The answer denied both of them the seductive comfort of blaming one person for everything they lost. Caleb's final leverage emerged when investigators examined the recorder and found a hidden digital partition containing current financial records. Those files proved he had continued blackmailing officials, developers, and nonprofit boards for more than a decade, using Riverbend as the template for later schemes. They also showed that Caleb had sent anonymous tips to Naomi, Lucas, and Senator Hayes, gradually guiding each person toward selected evidence. He wanted the network exposed because Daniel had stopped paying him, and Thomas Langford's death eliminated his most powerful protection. Caleb did not seek justice. He sought control over the collapse, intending to trade evidence for immunity and rebuild himself as a whistleblower. Mara refused his proposed deal and secured charges based upon the bank records, Price's notebook, and the original audio. Before agents transferred him, Caleb told Ethan that none of this would have happened if he had simply married a woman who understood ambition. Ethan answered that the scheme worked because too many men believed ambition excused the people it crushed. The investigation expanded across 12 states, forcing Carter Global, the Langford Foundation, and several municipal agencies to release records they had protected for years. Daniel pleaded guilty to fraud, conspiracy, witness intimidation, and obstruction after the audio destroyed his coercion defense, although he continued insisting he never intended anyone to die. Caleb faced additional charges connected to Samuel Price's collision when vehicle records showed his company disabled a safety sensor the day before the crash. Thomas Langford could no longer face trial, but Victoria authorized publication of his private correspondence, including letters where he described Riverbend residents as obstacles to productive land use. The disclosures devastated her mother and divided the Langford family, yet they also allowed affected communities to challenge property transfers built upon fraudulent condemnations. Ethan's board placed him on indefinite leave, and Carter Global's stock lost nearly half its value before investigators confirmed that most employees had no connection to the scheme. Thousands of workers feared consequences for decisions made above them, proving that accountability could harm innocent people when institutions concentrated power too narrowly. Ethan refused the board's proposal to return under a rebranding campaign centered on his deception by Daniel. Instead, he called for a restructuring that transferred redevelopment assets into a public benefit corporation governed by residents, employees, independent experts, and investors. Shareholders accused him of surrendering valuable property to relieve personal guilt, while community leaders distrusted a plan developed by the same company that displaced them. Naomi challenged the proposal publicly because Ethan initially offered advisory seats rather than actual voting authority. During a tense hearing, she told him that listening without surrendering control remained another form of management, and he answered that investors would reject a structure they could not influence. Lena Ortiz, whose family had lived near Riverbend for 3 generations, asked why residents should accept a system designed around investors' comfort when residents had carried the risk. Ethan had no polished answer, so he withdrew his plan and invited the community coalition to draft the governance structure themselves. The decision cost him support from directors, yet it marked the first time he allowed people affected by his choices to define the solution. Victoria moved out of Ethan's apartment, not because she stopped loving him, but because their postponed wedding exposed how much of their relationship depended upon momentum. She had admired his certainty, and he had admired her calm, allowing both of them to avoid questions about how they responded when love became inconvenient. They began counseling separately and together, speaking about ambition, inheritance, and the habit of performing strength for families that treated vulnerability as weakness. Victoria admitted she once viewed Naomi as evidence that Ethan could abandon any woman whose values interrupted his goals. Ethan confessed that he invited Naomi to the wedding because some prideful part of him wanted her to witness the stability he had built after their divorce. Sending the invitation had been his decision, although Daniel later forged the confirmation and manipulated the seating plan. The admission hurt Victoria more than the scandal, because it revealed that Naomi remained present inside their relationship as an unexamined wound. She told Ethan she would not marry him until he stopped defining commitment as proof that the past no longer mattered. Naomi faced a quieter crisis when the National Community Design Council offered her permanent leadership and praised her role in exposing Riverbend. The appointment promised influence over billions in public development, yet several board members wanted to use her story as evidence that principled experts could correct corrupt systems from above. Naomi recognized the same paternalism she criticized in corporations, disguised beneath better language and kinder intentions. She accepted only after securing permanent resident representation on project boards and limiting her own authority over funding decisions. Her colleagues warned that shared power would slow approvals, while Naomi acknowledged that speed had become the favorite excuse of people who did not bear consequences. She also began therapy after recognizing that relentless service had allowed her to avoid grief, intimacy, and the fear that a personal life might again be sacrificed to someone else's ambition. Her flaw had never been weakness. It was the belief that usefulness made vulnerability unnecessary. 6 months after the wedding, Lucas located Samuel Price's daughter, Claire, who had spent years believing her father died after accepting a bribe. Caleb had mailed her falsified bank records shortly after the crash, ensuring she would never investigate the case or preserve his papers. Mara returned Price's notebook and explained that her father had refused the money and attempted to protect Riverbend. Claire wept with anger rather than relief, because truth restored his integrity without restoring the years she spent ashamed of him. She agreed to release his records publicly on the condition that the investigation create protections for inspectors who challenged politically connected developers. Her demand transformed Price from a tragic witness into the foundation for practical reform. Naomi invited Claire to help design the new reporting system, while Ethan funded it through a blind restitution trust that prohibited naming rights or personal recognition. For once, his money entered the story without purchasing control over how the story would be told. The community governance plan eventually won approval after Carter Global employees supported it against several institutional investors. Workers had discovered that Daniel's network diverted pension contributions and manipulated project bonuses, giving them a direct stake in reform. The new corporation reserved equal voting blocks for residents, employees, public interest directors, and long-term investors, preventing any single group from controlling decisions alone. Ethan resigned as chief executive and surrendered enough voting shares to make the structure permanent, although he retained a limited governance role, subject to removal by the other blocks. The company hired an operations leader known for rebuilding institutions after compliance failures, and no member of Ethan's family received automatic board access. Critics called the plan symbolic, while supporters called it revolutionary, but Naomi considered both descriptions premature. Structures mattered only when tested by ordinary disagreements. After public attention faded and compromise became more difficult than promises. 1 year after the interrupted wedding, Riverbend Community Center reopened on the same block where fire had ended its first life. The new building preserved a section of smoke-darkened brick behind glass, not as decoration, but as evidence of what happened when ambition, fear, and silence reinforced one another. Lena directed the community library, Lucas managed transparency systems for the Benefit Corporation, and Claire Price led an independent inspector protection program named for no individual, including her father. Daniel attended sentencing that morning and received a substantial prison term, while Caleb's trial continued because he refused every agreement requiring a complete admission. Ethan arrived without reporters and spent the afternoon assembling shelves beside apprentices from the neighborhood. Naomi watched him measure the same board 3 times, then reminded him that he still distrusted instructions he did not understand. He smiled and answered that some habits now deserved suspicion. Victoria arrived near sunset carrying 2 paper cups of coffee and found Ethan outside the restored center, where children were drawing plans for parks they believed adults might actually build. She told him that her family foundation had completed its restructuring, transferring disputed assets into community trusts and replacing inherited board seats with elected terms. Her mother still refused to speak with her, and several relatives considered the disclosure an unforgivable betrayal. Yet Victoria no longer confused family peace with moral innocence. Ethan asked whether she regretted postponing the wedding, and she replied that marrying him that day would have rewarded both of them for ignoring questions already waiting beneath the ceremony. Their year apart had not returned them to the relationship they planned. It had required them to decide whether a different relationship could be built from clearer choices. Victoria wanted partnership without worship, honesty without cruelty, and enough independence that neither person became the other's evidence of success. Ethan said he wanted the same, although he understood wanting it mattered less than practicing it when no crisis forced attention. They married 4 months later inside Riverbend Community Center, with fewer than 70 guests and no magazine contract. The ceremony occurred in the library, beneath windows designed by neighborhood students, while wildflowers from Lena's garden rested in mismatched glass jars. Naomi attended beside Charles Whitmore and Claire Price, sitting among residents rather than in any ceremonial place of honor. Victoria's mother remained absent, but Lucas stood beside his sister and reminded her that incomplete families could still witness honest beginnings. Ethan's vows included no promises about never failing, because the previous year had taught him how easily perfection became another performance. He promised to ask questions before accepting convenient answers, to remain present when consequences embarrassed him, and to never treat love as something that should quietly accommodate his priorities. Victoria promised to speak before resentment hardened into dignity, and to choose truth even when silence preserved the appearance of harmony. After the ceremony, Ethan found Naomi beside the preserved wall of smoke-darkened brick, where the original Riverbend covenant appeared beneath protective glass. He thanked her for attending, then admitted that part of him once imagined redemption would require her forgiveness. Naomi replied that forgiveness was not certification, and no former wife could declare a man permanently changed on behalf of everyone affected by his choices. She had forgiven him for the marriage they failed to protect, but the residents, employees, and families deserved to judge his public actions through time. Ethan accepted the distinction without searching for a warmer answer. Naomi then acknowledged her own mistake, explaining that she had spent years turning self-reliance into a fortress because needing anyone felt dangerously close to disappearing again. Riverbend taught her that people could share responsibility without surrendering identity, provided power remained visible and disagreement remained safe. Their conversation contained affection, regret, and no invitation to reclaim what had ended. Charles joined them with the old photograph of Ethan and Naomi working at the first Riverbend site, both younger, dusty, and unaware of the compromises ahead. The image had appeared throughout the investigation, often used by journalists as evidence of lost love or abandoned ideals. Naomi proposed placing it in the center's public archive beside Price's notebook, Daniel's confession, the forged covenant, and the corrected governance charter. Ethan agreed only if resident testimony surrounded every institutional document, preventing future visitors from mistaking executives for the central characters. The resulting exhibit opened several months later and became a training site for architects, inspectors, nonprofit directors, and corporate boards. It did not present corruption as the work of a few uniquely evil men, because Caleb and Daniel succeeded inside systems that rewarded secrecy, urgency, and unquestioned authority. It also refused simple redemption, showing that Ethan's reforms became meaningful only after others received power to challenge him. Naomi's foundation changed as deeply as Carter Global. Although the transformation attracted fewer headlines, she reduced her executive authority, created elected community seats, and allowed younger architects to reject designs she once considered essential. Delegation exposed how much identity she had built around being the person who never abandoned a difficult project. Without constant crisis, she had to discover what remained when usefulness no longer occupied every hour. She began teaching one semester each year, spent weekends with friends who expected nothing from her professionally, and allowed a thoughtful urban historian named Marcus Reed to invite her to dinner 3 times before she finally accepted. Their relationship developed without dramatic rescue or instant certainty, which made it feel unfamiliar and therefore worth exploring. Naomi learned that intimacy did not require shrinking her work, while Marcus learned not to mistake her independence for an absence of need. 2 years after the orchestra stopped, Naomi returned to the Astoria Grand Hotel for a national housing conference. The ballroom had been renovated, yet she recognized the final row where the warning envelope began dismantling several carefully protected lives. During a break, Victoria approached with a photograph of her and Ethan planting a tree beside Riverbend's new accessibility garden. She explained that they had chosen not to have the image published because private evidence sometimes mattered more than public recognition. Naomi noticed their marriage had become quieter, less polished, and more credible because neither person appeared responsible for completing the other. Victoria asked whether Naomi ever wondered what would have happened if the envelope had arrived 1 day later. Naomi answered that Caleb believed he controlled the timing, but the truth had been moving toward them for years, through Samuel Price, Lucas, Lena, and every resident who refused to forget. That evening, Naomi delivered the conference's closing address without describing the wedding or naming the powerful people involved. She spoke about buildings that looked flawless, while stress accumulated behind sealed walls, then explained that institutions failed in much the same way when warnings became inconvenient. Integrity, she said, was not a trait possessed by heroes. It was a structure that allowed ordinary people to question authority without losing their homes, jobs, families, or dignity. She did not offer a polished lesson about hardship making everyone stronger, because hardship often left damage that no inspiring conclusion could erase. Instead, she argued that people became trustworthy by deciding what they would do with truths that arrived too late to prevent pain, but early enough to change the future. When the audience rose, Naomi thanked them, gathered her notes, and walked through the bronze doors into the winter evening. The story had never been about an ex-wife entering a billionaire's wedding and proving what he lost. It was about several flawed people discovering that truth could destroy the lives they performed, then choosing to build more honest ones from what remained.